My parents said, "We know you spent $450,000 to save our house, but your brother doesn't want you at Christmas." I just replied, "Okay, noted." That was the night they realized I was done being taken for granted. What happened next shocked them. My name is Ava Miller, and on the night everything changed, I was sitting alone in a quiet office tower in downtown Portland, Oregon, watching the city disappear under the first soft snowfall of December. I was 31, a senior risk analyst who had built a life around calm decisions, clean numbers, and steady hands. People often told me I was the rock in every crisis, and maybe that was true, at least professionally. But outside the office, in the space where family should have felt like home, I had always been more like a spare part, useful, dependable, forgettable. That night, I didn't know yet that my family was about to make that painfully clear. It was close to 9 p.m. when my phone buzzed against the edge of my desk. The office was nearly empty, just the hum of the heater and the distant whir of a copy machine resetting itself for the night. I glanced at the screen expecting a work notification, but instead, Mom's name lit up with a short message. "Call us right now. It's important." My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with familiarity. Urgent messages from my parents rarely meant emergencies. They usually meant money, or David. Usually both. I exhaled slowly, pressed the call button, and waited. Mom answered immediately, her voice more composed than usual. "Ava, sweetie, finally. We've been waiting." Dad's heavy breathing hovered behind her, the way it always did when he wanted the conversation to end before it even began. "What's going on?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. Mom didn't waste time. "Your father and I. We found the paperwork." Her tone wasn't accusing, it was oddly formal, matter of fact. "We know you used $450,000 to save the house. The mortgage, the taxes, everything." I blinked at the wall, my expression unreadable. "Okay," I said quietly. I hadn't expected gratitude, and I certainly hadn't received any when I paid it, so the sudden acknowledgement now felt almost absurd. But then her voice shifted into something even calmer, almost clinical. "Anyway," she said, "your brother doesn't want you at Christmas this year." For a second, I thought I misheard her. "I'm sorry, what?" "David said it would make things complicated if you came," she continued. "He feels uncomfortable, especially after everything that happened with the house." Dad spoke up then, his tone firm as if delivering a verdict. "It's better if you sit this one out, Ava, just for this year. We need to respect your brother's feelings." I stared at my dimmed computer screen, my reflection faintly visible against a spreadsheet I had been working on for hours. "Just so I understand," I said slowly, each word measured. "You're excluding me from Christmas because David doesn't want me there?" Mom didn't even pause. "Yes, honey. He's under stress, and we don't want to aggravate him. It's the holidays. Let's keep things peaceful." Peaceful. The words slid over me like ice water. They were talking about peace while cutting out the only child who had paid nearly $500,000 to keep a roof over their heads. They were choosing my brother again with the same ease people choose a dessert at a restaurant. No hesitation, no consideration. I felt nothing at first. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Just an eerie, absolute stillness. As if my emotions had stepped outside the room and left me sitting alone for a moment. In that void, I could hear the faint buzzing of a fluorescent light above me and the soft tap of snowflakes hitting the window. "Okay," I said. My voice surprised even me, steady, flat, a single unbroken line. Then I added the only two words that felt right, two words that didn't plead or protest, two words that marked a quiet split inside me. "Noted." A strange silence followed. I think they expected me to argue, or cry, or ask if they were serious. But they had underestimated how many times a person can be pushed aside before the wound becomes scar tissue. "Well," Mom said, sounding thrown off for the first time. "I'm glad you understand." The call ended there. I sat motionless for a good 30 seconds, the phone still in my hand, screen gone black. My breath came out slow, steady, almost fogging the air even though the room was warm. And I realized this wasn't new. Being excluded wasn't new. Being last place wasn't new. What was new was the clarity. The way everything in my life suddenly aligned into one sharp, undeniable truth. The people I had spent my whole life supporting would never choose me, not even for Christmas. I stood, grabbed my coat, and walked down the long hallway toward the elevator. The building felt frozen in time, the kind of silence that made every footstep sound like a question with no answer. Outside, the cold hit my face instantly. Snow was falling in light, delicate specks that melted the moment they touched my skin. The parking lot was almost empty, just a few lonely cars dusted white under the yellow glow of streetlights. I walked slowly, my boots crunching through the thin layer of snow. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't breaking. I felt like someone who had finally opened their eyes after 30 years of living in a dim room. Noted, I whispered to myself not as a response to them, but as a promise to me. By the time I reached my car, a quiet memory tugged at me from somewhere deep inside, something old and familiar, the beginning of a story I had tried to forget. My childhood in Salem, the imbalance that shaped everything, and the brother who had always been placed above me. And as I sat behind the wheel, watching the snow blur the world outside, I knew that to understand what had just happened, I had to remember where it all truly began. As I sat in my car that snowy night, watching the windshield slowly cloud over, my mind drifted somewhere I hadn't visited in years, back to Salem, Oregon, where everything had quietly begun long before I understood any of it. Our old house was a 2-story place with fading blue paint, a wide backyard that smelled like wet pine every winter, and a creaky wooden swing. Dad kept promising to fix but never did. To most people, it looked like an ordinary family home. But to me, it was the first classroom where I learned roles I never agreed to play. David and I grew up under the same roof, but not under the same rules. He was 2 years older, the golden son from the moment he took his first breath, at least that's how it felt. My parents didn't call him that, of course. They used phrases like, full of potential, needs to be invested in, or deserves every opportunity. And opportunities were exactly what he received. Private tutors, robotics clubs, summer science camps, tennis lessons, a new bike every other Christmas, then a nicer one when he outgrew that. When he turned 16, Dad handed him the keys to a used but spotless Honda Civic, bought specifically to ensure David didn't fall behind the other boys. Meanwhile, I grew up hearing a different refrain. Ava's strong. Ava's independent. Ava knows how to take care of herself. It sounded like praise at first, but the older I got, the more I realized those words were less about admiring me and more about justifying everything they didn't give me. I was 7 when Mom first handed me a stack of envelopes and said, "Sweetie, can you help me organize these bills? You're so good with numbers." I didn't understand a thing written on them, but I tried. At 8, she had me copy down household expenses into a notebook because you write neater than I do. At 9, I was balancing the grocery list against the weekly budget. I remember sitting at the kitchen counter with my legs dangling off the chair, trying to stretch the food money further so Mom wouldn't sigh the way she did whenever she looked at the bank account. By the time I hit middle school, I could calculate late fees, track bill cycles, and predict which month Dad would forget the electric payment again. Not because I wanted to, but because someone had to. And in our family, someone always meant me. David, on the other hand, never touched a bill in his life. He breezed through childhood with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. When he wanted a new laptop, they saved for it. When he wanted to join a club that cost hundreds every semester, they found the money somehow. When he struggled with a class, they hired a tutor within a week. Every problem he had was treated like a crisis. Every problem I had was treated like something I'd eventually figure out on my own. I still remember one evening in the living room. I must have been around 11. David cried because he got a B on a science test. Mom hugged him, stroked his hair, and whispered, "We'll get you whatever help you need, sweetheart. We believe in your potential." I sat at the dining table nearby, working through my homework alone, my head down. My math grade had dropped too, that year. No one asked why. The message was clear even then. David was the future. I was the fallback plan. But what I remember most vividly about those years wasn't resentment, it was responsibility. A kind of quiet responsibility that seeped into my bones before I understood how heavy it was. I was the kid who remembered appointments, who reminded Dad to pay the water bill, who packed the family backpack on day trips, who checked that the back door was locked at night. If something slipped through the cracks, the house felt off-kilter. If David forgot something, it was excused. If I forgot something, it was a lesson in being more careful next time. There was one afternoon in high school that sums up our childhood perfectly. Mom sat at the dining table sorting mail, the late afternoon light slanting across the wood. David walked in, excited, waving a flyer for some competitive leadership camp in California. "Mom, I want to go. Everyone cool is applying." She scanned the flyer and without hesitation said, "We'll make it work. This could be huge for your future." Then, almost as an afterthought, she turned to me and asked, "Ava, can you help me calculate the costs and payment deadlines? You're the organized one." David got the camp. I got the spreadsheets. But the moment that stayed with me longest happened on a rainy Saturday when I was maybe 15. I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen while I cleaned the living room. Mom sounded tired but determined. "David needs every advantage," she said quietly. "He could really be someone. We have to invest in him." Dad responded in a grunt. "And Ava?" Another pause. The kind of pause that teaches you something without a single word being spoken. "Ava's strong," Mom concluded. "She'll be fine. She always is." I remember wiping the counter mechanically, pretending I hadn't heard a thing, pretending I didn't feel something in my chest shift into a place I'd never quite be able to shift back from. That was the day I understood the truth. They weren't ignoring me out of malice, they just truly believed I didn't need them. They thought I was built to endure. Maybe that's why I became the person I am today, calm, collected, the one who steadies the ground when everything else is shaking. But strength built from necessity isn't the same as being cared for. And independence forced too early becomes a cage disguised as competence. Sitting in my car decades later, watching the snowfall blur the world outside, I realized that the phone call I'd just received wasn't an isolated wound. It was simply the final echo of a childhood where my worth was measured by how much I could hold together. And for the first time in 30 years, I felt something shift not inside my family, but inside me. By the time I left Salem for college, the roles in our family were already carved in stone. David was the one being launched toward greatness, and I was the one who kept the gears from jamming. Nothing dramatic, nothing spoken outright. Just a quiet assignment handed to me through years of patterns, expectations, and the kind of praise that feels more like duty than love. It didn't surprise anyone when I earned a full scholarship to Oregon State. I worked for it late nights studying at the dining table, tutoring classmates for extra cash, stacking every achievement I could like bricks under my feet. My parents congratulated me, of course, but in a tone that suggested it made perfect sense. "Ava's smart," they said. "Ava figures things out." As if effort and exhaustion were my native language. David's path was different. When he got into a private university in California, the celebration lasted for weeks. There were dinners, phone calls to relatives, even a small backyard party. "He deserves this," Mom kept repeating. "We want him to have the best." And he got the best tuition support, monthly allowance, money for clubs, conferences, equipment, and eventually an off-campus apartment they helped him pay for. Not because they were wealthy, but because they believed investing in David was a necessity. Investing in me was optional. Meanwhile, I juggled 2 part-time jobs, one in the campus library, another at a tiny cafe where I steamed endless cups of burnt-smelling coffee at 5 a.m. I learned to stretch $1 so far it practically snapped. Ramen, used textbooks, thrift store clothes, long walks instead of bus fare. I didn't resent it, not then. I simply assumed it was normal, that independence was something I owed myself because no one else would offer it. But college was also the beginning of another chapter, one where my family's financial emergencies somehow became mine. The pattern started slowly. A call from Mom one evening during midterms. "Sweetie, could you cover the electric bill? I'll pay you back next week. Things are just tight right now. I said yes without thinking. I was 18, barely able to feed myself, but she sounded stressed, and helping felt like the only logical response. The next week came and went, no repayment, but another request came instead. Then came Dad's traffic ticket that he forgot to pay. The overdraft fees on their checking account. The Wi-Fi bill they hadn't realized was 62 days late. I became the person they called for every gap, every mistake, every deadline they missed. Just until we catch up, they said, but they never caught up. They never tried to, either not when they had me. By the time I graduated, it wasn't unusual for me to wake up to 3 missed calls and a text like, "Ava, can you help cover this until we get paid? David is under so much pressure already." Somehow, everything was always about not stressing David. His future, his focus, his mental health. And mine? Mine was apparently sturdy enough to absorb anything without cracking. When I got my first real job, a junior risk analyst position in Portland, my salary wasn't huge, but it was stable. I thought that stability meant freedom. Instead, my family treated it like a shared bank account, not explicitly, never with malicious intent, but with a quiet certainty that I would help because I always had. I still remember my first month living in Portland. I was excited, nervous, and broke from the move. That's when Mom called to say they'd accidentally missed 3 mortgage payments. "We'll lose the house if we don't catch up," she whispered, as if the neighbors might hear. "Can you spot us this month? We'll pay you back." Of course they didn't, and I didn't ask. Asking felt pointless, like trying to return a glass of water after you've poured it into the ocean. Soon, handling their crises became part of my weekly routine. If my phone buzzed, I assumed something was overdue. Car insurance lapses. Credit card minimums. A medical bill David forgot to mail. Late fees that multiplied like weeds. Once, they called because David needed a deposit for a new apartment, something about networking with the right people. And although I couldn't afford it, I paid it. Because wasn't that my job? Hadn't it always been? It's funny how you can become the backbone of something without anyone acknowledging that you're holding it up. I didn't get thank yous anymore. Not real ones. Just comments like, "You're so reliable, Ava," said with the same tone someone might use to praise a dishwasher for not breaking down. The worst part is how deeply I internalized it. Being the responsible one became my identity. If there was a fire, I put it out. If there was a bill, I covered it. If something slipped, I caught it before anyone noticed. At work, I analyzed financial risks for corporations, but at home, I analyzed the risks of my family falling apart. And every time I stabilized something for them, every time I paid, soothed, solved, patched, I strengthened the belief that I didn't need help, that I wasn't allowed to need it, that I was by default the financial safety net for people older, wealthier, and more capable of managing their own lives. I started to understand the truth around my mid-20s. I wasn't just a daughter. I wasn't a sister. I had become the unofficial household treasurer, crisis manager, and emergency fund rolled into one. And my family had quietly, almost lovingly, assigned me that role without ever calling it by its real name, their bank. And the worst part? I kept fulfilling that role because I didn't know how not to. Because somewhere deep inside, the little girl who learned to stretch grocery money still believed that holding everything together was the only way to be valued. Sitting alone in the car years later, snow falling gently outside, I realized something that hurt more than the Christmas call itself. This pattern had started so long ago that my family didn't even recognize it as a pattern. To them, I had always been the person who could handle anything. So of course I could handle this too. Except, for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to. A year before the Christmas call, the call that finally drew a line through my heart, I faced the biggest financial crisis my family had ever pulled me into. It started with a voicemail from Mom, her voice breathless, trembling in a way I had only heard twice in my life. Once when she crashed the car years ago, and once when David failed a college class that almost cost him his scholarship. "Ava, "Call me back," she said. "It's urgent. It's the house." Quote. I called immediately, and Mom answered on the first ring. She didn't waste a second. "We got a notice today," she gasped. "A foreclosure notice." My heart sank, but I didn't panic. Not because it wasn't serious, but because panic had never been a luxury available to me. "Send me everything," I told her calmly. "Every document, every bill, every letter. I'll look at it tonight," she cried in relief. "I knew you'd know what to do," she whispered. When the PDFs arrived, I opened them on my laptop in my small Portland apartment, sitting on the edge of my bed with a notebook and a pen. As I scanned through the pages, the weight of what my parents were facing settled over me like wet cement. 3 months of unpaid mortgage. Accumulated late fees. An interest rate spike from a previous refinance they had agreed to without reading the fine print. Credit card debt so high, I had to count the zeros twice. Property taxes overdue by nearly a year. And then buried among the papers, a line item showing money my parents had lent David for business investments, which he had never repaid. It wasn't one mistake. It wasn't even a series of mistakes. It was years of mismanagement, denial, and wishful thinking stacked into a mountain that was now collapsing, and the foreclosure date was set. Weeks away. If they didn't pay a significant portion immediately. The house, the place where I grew up, the only place my mother had ever lived since marrying my father, would be taken. That night, I drove to Salem. It was dark when I arrived, but the entire house was awake. Mom was pacing. Dad was sweating. David was talking fast about some big investment payout that was so close. The same line I had heard 100 times. If pressure were currency, David would have been a billionaire long ago. As I stepped into the kitchen, all eyes turned to me. Not because I was the favorite, not because they trusted my wisdom, but because they trusted my ability to fix things. "It's bad," I said, laying the papers on the table. "Worse than I expected." Mom let out a small sob. Dad rubbed his forehead. David leaned back, arms crossed, as if waiting for me to present a solution like an employee delivering a report. "How much do we need?" Dad finally asked. "To stop the foreclosure?" I replied. "At least $120,000 right now, and more to stabilize everything long term." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Dad muttered something about refinancing again, but I shook my head. "You won't qualify. Not with your credit. And not with this level of delinquency." David jumped in, eager to look useful. "Like I said, my investment is coming soon. I can put in money once that hits." I looked at him, exhausted. "David, your investment has been coming for 3 years. He scowled. "You don't understand business." I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. Later that night, while the rest of the house spiraled between despair and denial, I stepped into my old childhood bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. I stared at the wall, thinking. I had savings carefully built over years of budgeting, sacrifices, delayed vacations, skipped luxuries, money that wasn't for emergencies, money that was supposed to be my future. A down payment for a home. A sense of stability I'd never had growing up. It was the nest I had built for myself because no one else ever would. But now, that future was pulling against the present in the ugliest possible way. I could walk away. I could say, "I'm sorry, I can't help you. This isn't my responsibility." And I would be right. Completely, morally, ethically right. But the truth was simple and brutal. If I didn't step in, they would lose the house. And as much as I resented being the family's safety net, I couldn't bring myself to let my mother lose the home she had poured her entire life into. That house was where she planted her garden every spring, where she decorated the living room with garlands every Christmas, where she stayed up late sewing costumes for my middle school plays. A lifetime lived between those walls. So I made the choice. I told them the next morning. "I'll cover it," I said. "All of it." Mom burst into tears of relief. Dad finally exhaled. David nodded like I had confirmed something he already suspected. not gratitude expectation. And then, the moment that should have stung the most, they didn't ask what it would cost me, how much of my savings it would drain, what dreams I was sacrificing to save theirs. They simply accepted it. Over the next few days, I paid everything. The mortgage arrears, the property taxes, the interest, the credit cards, every bleeding financial wound they had ignored until it became fatal. In total, it came out to nearly $450,000, money that had taken me a decade to earn and save. I refinanced the house in my name temporarily so they wouldn't lose it. I met with bankers, negotiated penalties, and structured repayments. By the time I was done, the house was safe. My parents thanked me once, briefly, softly, like someone thanking the mailman for dropping off a package. Then, within weeks, the crisis faded into the background, and my role in saving them was rewritten as something almost inevitable. "Ava handled it," they'd say, shrugging with the comfort of people whose burden had been lifted before they even felt its full weight. David never mentioned paying them back. Not once. Life resumed as if I hadn't single-handedly kept them from collapsing, and that more than the exhaustion, more than the money was what stayed with me. Because when you save people who refuse to change, the reward is often silence, not gratitude, not respect. Just silence layered over an expectation that you'll do it again. And a year later, when they told me I wasn't welcome at Christmas, that silence finally became impossible to ignore. When I got home after the call where my parents calmly informed me that my brother didn't want me at Christmas, and they agreed, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse against the door like someone in a movie whose world had just shattered. Instead, I walked into my apartment, hung my coat on the hook by the door, and stood in the silence. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of impact, the moment right after something sharp enters you but before the pain blooms, like being stabbed in a way that doesn't draw blood, only breath. I sank onto the couch without turning on the lights. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the city outside my window, a street lamp flickering against falling snow, headlights sliding past on the wet pavement, the red blinking of a distant radio tower. I stared into that dimness and tried to understand what I was feeling. It wasn't shock. Nothing my family did could shock me anymore. It wasn't even betrayal. Betrayal requires the expectation of loyalty. What I felt was something smaller and heavier, a quiet, sinking realization that I had spent my entire life standing in a place I was never meant to stand. Being excluded wasn't new. Being unappreciated wasn't new. Being the afterthought wasn't new. What was new was that, for the first time, I saw the pattern clearly. Saw how deeply the roots ran. Saw how long I had allowed myself to play the role of the strong one, the mature one, the reliable one, as if those labels meant I didn't need love, inclusion, or softness. As if being capable meant being invulnerable. I had told myself for years that someday, my parents would see me. Someday, they would realize I was more than the person who solved their crises. Someday they would treat me like a daughter, not a resource. But that night, hearing the steadiness in my mother's voice as she said David feels uncomfortable, hearing my father back her up without hesitation, that was the moment I understood. They weren't going to see me, not ever. Because they didn't think they needed to, and maybe for the first time, I questioned whether I needed them. I let my head fall back against the couch and closed my eyes. The apartment felt too quiet, too still. The kind of stillness that forces you to hear your own thoughts whether you want to or not. I thought about every Christmas before this one. The years when I wrapped everyone's gifts, double-checked the grocery list, cleaned the kitchen while everyone else went to nap. The years when David's preferences dictated the entire schedule, what movie we watched, what food we ate, what traditions we followed. The years when my parents praised me for being easygoing, which was just a kinder way of saying, you don't require anything from us. Maybe that was why it hurt so much now. Not because they excluded me, but because they did it so effortlessly. As if the thought of how I would feel never even crossed their minds. I brought my hands to my face and let out a long exhale. Not a sob, not even a tremble. Just the releasing of air that had been held too tightly for too long. And then, in the quiet that followed, something small and surprising stirred inside me. Not devastation, but clarity. A realization so sharp it cut through the numbness. I had never created a Christmas for myself. Not once. Not in 31 years. I had shown up for everyone else. Filled the gaps, covered the costs, emotional and financial. Cooked the meals, set the table, smiled through the tension, played the role. And somehow, all those years, it had never occurred to me that I could craft a holiday that reflected what I needed, not what everyone else demanded. The idea felt foreign and gentle, like touching a part of myself I hadn't known existed. A Christmas for me. A space where nothing was expected of me except presence. A table where I didn't have to prove my worth to earn a seat. My thoughts drifted toward people around me, people I cared about, people who, like me, didn't have a place to go this holiday. There was Mr. Ellis, my elderly neighbor down the hall. He was 82, widowed, with shaky hands and a soft voice that cracked mid-sentence. He spent most holidays alone because his son lived across the country and rarely visited. I'd run into him last week in the hallway. He told me he planned to heat up soup on Christmas Day and watch old Western movies. Then there was Maya, a single mother from my department. She had a 4-year-old daughter and a bank account that never survived past the 15th of the month. She once admitted, in a moment of exhaustion, that she couldn't afford the flight home to Texas this year. "We'll do our own little Christmas," she'd said with a forced smile. "Maybe bake cookies if the oven doesn't die again." And then there were the kids from the youth mentoring program I volunteered for, bright, awkward teenagers who aged out of foster care or grew up in unstable homes. Holidays were complicated for them, painful even. I'd heard one of them joking that Christmas for him meant pretending to be asleep so the day goes faster. As I thought about them, something softened in my chest. These were people who understood what it felt like to be left out. People who knew loneliness not as a moment but as a season. People who didn't expect anything from me except sincerity. And for once, the idea of not being with my family didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like freedom. Slowly, deliberately, I sat up. I turned on the lamp beside me, bathing the room in warm yellow light. Then I opened my laptop and typed 3 words into the search bar: Christmas dinner ideas. Not fancy ones, not elaborate ones, just warm meals, comforting meals, dishes that tasted like welcome. Next, I opened the group chat with my mentoring teens and typed, "If anyone needs a place on Christmas Eve, my home is open. No questions asked." Then I sent a message to Maya. "If you and Emma don't have plans Christmas night, come by my place. I'll cook." And finally, I walked down the hall and slipped a small note under Mr. Ellis's door. "I'm hosting a small dinner on Christmas. You're warmly invited if you'd like company." When I returned to my apartment, the air felt different, lighter, brighter, as if choosing myself even in a small way had cracked open a window I never noticed was sealed. I looked around my living room, imagining it filled with warm food, soft light, mismatched chairs pulled from the kitchen, and people who might not be related to me, but who showed more kindness in their everyday interactions than my family had in years. This Christmas wouldn't be extravagant. No expensive decorations, no picture-perfect displays, no carefully curated traditions. There would just be a table with warm food, yellow lights, and a place for anyone who walked through my door. A Christmas built on sincerity, not obligation. A Christmas that belonged to me. And as I sat there, allowing the idea to settle, I realized something both simple and profound. Maybe this was the first true Christmas of my life. Not because it would be perfect, but because it would be mine, shaped by my choices, my values, and the people I welcomed, not the people who pushed me aside. For the first time in 31 years, I wasn't preparing to show up for someone else's holiday. I was preparing to create my own. Christmas Eve arrived quietly, like a soft breath against the edges of winter. Outside, Portland was wrapped in a thin white coat of snow, and the city lights flickered through the frosted windows of my apartment. Inside, I moved slowly around my kitchen, stirring pots, checking timers, tasting soups, adjusting the lights exactly the way I wanted them: warm, dim, comforting, like candlelight without the flames. It wasn't extravagant, it wasn't magazine pretty, it was just warm. And for the first time, that felt like enough. I set out mismatched plates I'd collected over the years, some thrifted, some gifted, some bought on sale, and placed them around the small dining table I had pushed into the center of the living room. I draped a soft beige tablecloth across it, laid a string of fairy lights down the middle, and put a bowl of pine cones from a park nearby as a makeshift centerpiece. My apartment smelled like cinnamon, roasted vegetables, and the kind of slow-cooked meal that feels like an embrace. When the first knock came, it startled me. For a moment, my stomach fluttered not with fear, but with something I hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation, mixed with a touch of vulnerability. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door to find Mr. Ellis, my elderly neighbor, standing there with a shy, almost embarrassed smile. He was holding a small, slightly dented tin. "I brought something," he said, lifting the tin a little. "It's an old fruitcake recipe. I'm not sure how good it is anymore. I made it a few days back." I smiled, stepping aside to let him in. "Thank you for bringing it. It smells wonderful already." His shoulders relaxed a little as he walked inside, his eyes scanning the lights, the table, the small tree in the corner. "You've made it cozy in here," he murmured. "My wife would have liked this." I felt a gentle warmth in my chest. Minutes later, another knock. This time, it was Maya, holding her daughter Emma's tiny hand. Emma looked up at me with big brown eyes, clutching a stuffed reindeer. "We brought cookies," she announced proudly, lifting a Tupperware container covered with stickers. "Store-bought," Maya whispered apologetically, cheeks flushed. "I didn't have time to—" "They're perfect," I said, and I meant it. Then, slowly, trickling one by one, the teens from my mentoring program arrived. There were 5 of them, awkward, unsure, shifting from foot to foot as if afraid they were intruding. The oldest, Jalen, held up a bag of chips. "We, didn't know what to bring," he said. "So we brought this." "It's great," I told him. "Come in, all of you." At first, everyone was quiet. Polite smiles, soft greetings, shoes shuffling on the rug. I guided them toward the table, poured warm cider into mismatched mugs, and encouraged them to sit wherever they liked. The silence felt a bit like the first snowfall, gentle, hesitant, waiting for something to land. But then Emma giggled at something Mr. Ellis said about reindeer flying too low this year. Jalen made a joke about the string lights looking like a Pinterest attempt gone right. Maya laughed, really laughed, the kind that shakes the shoulders. And suddenly, like someone unclipped the lid from a box of warmth, the room filled with sound. Soft laughter at first, then louder. Conversations overlapping, the hum of life settling into the corners of my home. Mr. Ellis placed his fruitcake at the center of the table, apologizing again for how old-fashioned it was. But when I sliced it, the sweet smell of cinnamon and nuts spread through the room, and everyone leaned in. "This tastes like Christmas," one of the teens said with his mouth full. Ellis looked down, eyes wet, pretending to adjust his glasses. Emma dragged her chair next to mine and asked if she could help serve mashed potatoes. Maya kept thanking me over and over, whispering, "You saved our holiday, Ava. You really did." Jalen and the others argued about which movies counted as real Christmas movies, debating between Home Alone and Die Hard, until Mr. Ellis chimed in that the only true Christmas movie was It's a Wonderful Life, which made all of them groan dramatically. At one point, the youngest teen, quiet, soft-spoken Lily, looked around the table and said in a voice so small the room had to fall silent to hear it, "This is my first Christmas dinner, ever." She didn't say it for pity. She said it with awe, like she was discovering something she thought only existed in movies. And everyone gently smiled at her, not with sadness but with the warmth of people who understood what it meant to have gone without something most people take for granted. This is the first Christmas that feels like Christmas, she added. My throat tightened. I glanced around my living room at the lights, the food, the shared space, and something inside me settled. Something that had been restless and aching for years. My family had pushed me out of their holiday, but without meaning to, they had pushed me into a better one, a real one built on kindness instead of obligation, warmth instead of duty. After dinner, we made hot chocolate with too many marshmallows. Emma insisted on adding whipped cream to everyone's cup, including Mr. Ellis's, who accepted it even though he claimed he hadn't had sugar after 7 p.m. in 20 years. Someone suggested playing music, so Lily connected her phone to my speaker and played a playlist of soft acoustic holiday songs. The sound filled the apartment, weaving through the laughter, the clinking of cups, the faint whistle of wind outside. We took a group photo, not planned, not posed, just everyone gathered naturally around the table with smiles that reached their eyes. When I looked at the picture later, I realized it was the first Christmas photo I'd ever been in where I didn't feel like a background character. As the evening wound down, one by one they gathered their coats, hugged me goodnight, and thanked me in voices that felt honest, not obligatory. Mr. Ellis squeezed my hand and whispered, "Your table felt like home tonight." Maya kissed my cheek and said she wished she had met me years ago. The teens promised to come help me take down decorations next week, already planning snacks and playlists for it. When the door finally closed and the apartment returned to quiet, I didn't feel empty. I felt full in a way I had never known. I walked around the room slowly, touching the back of a chair here, unplugging a string of lights there, taking in the remnants of warmth left behind like footprints. I sat on the couch, pulled a blanket over my legs, and let myself smile. A real smile, soft and deep, one that came from inside instead of being forced onto my face to keep the peace. My parents had cut me out of Christmas, but I had created something better, something that didn't require me to shrink, sacrifice, or disappear. A space where every person at the table mattered, including me. For the first time in my life, Christmas had been mine. And it was warm. The morning after Christmas arrived colder than the night before. A thin layer of frost clung to the windows, turning the city into a pale watercolor wash, and my apartment still held the faint smell of cinnamon and roasted vegetables from the night before. I woke up with a strange lightness in my chest, the kind that comes from doing something good, something right, something chosen. I wrapped myself in a blanket, holding a mug of warm tea, as I replayed the laughter, the warmth, the clinking mugs, the way everyone left a little happier than they arrived. For the first time in my life, the day after Christmas didn't feel like a descent back to reality. It felt like a gentle continuation of something good. And then the knock came. Sharp. Repeated. Not the knock of someone uncertain or polite. The kind that demanded, not requested, entry. Before I could even put down my mug, the knocking escalated into pounding. I walked to the door, heart tightening not with fear, but with that old, familiar heaviness I thought I had left behind. I opened it to find my parents and David standing in the hallway. No warning, no call, no text. Just 3 faces lined with cold anger. Mom stormed in first, brushing past me without waiting for an invitation. Dad followed, jaw clenched, shoulders stiff. David entered last, arms crossed, eyes flaming with indignation, as if he were the one betrayed. My apartment suddenly felt too small, too warm, too intimate for the storm they brought with them. Mom spun toward me. "How could you?" she snapped. Her voice was louder than I'd heard in years. "How dare you tell everyone we banned you from Christmas?" I blinked. "I didn't tell everyone anything." Dad stepped forward, face flushed. "Your aunt called us this morning. Your cousins, too. They said you told people we didn't let you come. You embarrassed us, Ava." Embarrassed. That was the word. Not hurt, not concerned, not even confused. Embarrassed. David scoffed dramatically, shaking his head. "This is unbelievable. You always twist things to make us look bad." I stared at him, heat rising in my palms but not my voice. "I told the truth." You did tell me not to come. David's face twisted. I said it would be uncomfortable for me. You didn't have to make a big deal about it. And Mom and Dad only agreed because you're always so dramatic. Mom cut in sharply. And now the whole family thinks we're cruel. We were humiliated at Christmas dinner. Humiliated, Ava. Dad chimed in, the words clipping out like snapped branches. You had no right to spread private family issues to outsiders. Outsiders. I almost laughed. Of course, neighbors, co-workers, kids I mentor, all outsiders. People who showed me more warmth in one evening than my family had shown me in years. But I didn't say a word. Mom looked around my apartment, then at the extra chair pulled up to the table, the crumbs left on plates, the pine cones still resting in the bowl. So you had your own little Christmas, she sneered. Did you tell everyone we abandoned you? That we're terrible parents? Her voice sharpened into something brittle. How could you do this to us? Do this to them? The thought echoed inside me. David stepped closer, jabbing a finger toward me like I was a delinquent employee. What you can do now, he declared, is make it right. His tone was matter-of-fact, confident, entitled. My project needs funding again. You know the situation I'm in. And the house after the storm last month? The roof is leaking. We need that fixed before January. He gestured between himself and our parents. So here's what we're thinking. You pay for the repairs and cover another round from my investment account. Then we'll all move past this. It was so astonishing, so absurd, so deeply familiar that I felt a strange detachment wash over me, like I was watching someone else's life from across the room. My family, my flesh and blood, had shown up the day after excluding me from Christmas, not to apologize, not to ask how I was, but to demand more money. David, I said quietly. You told them you didn't want me there. He threw his hands up. Because you make everything uncomfortable. You show up with your quiet judgment, acting like you're better than us. It's selfish, Ava. He leaned forward. But you can still fix all this. Do what you always do. Do what I always do. Hold everything together. Pay for the damage, financial and emotional. Absorb the blame. Dad nodded sternly, validating David's demands. Your brother is trying to build something important. We need you to support him right now instead of making things worse. And in that moment, something inside me fully, completely, stilled. Not broke, no. It didn't feel like breaking. It felt like everything had snapped into place. The truth I'd been circling finally settling where it belonged. They weren't here because they loved me. They weren't here because they missed me. They weren't even here because the family was upset. They were here because they needed their financial safety net back in its rightful position. They were here because, in their minds, I was still the fixer, still the responsible one, still the daughter who never said no. I sat on the arm of my couch, hands folded, shoulders relaxed, silence wrapped around me like a coat. And I let them talk, let them complain, accuse, demand for minutes that stretched into what felt like hours. Mom's voice rose and fell. Dad's anger simmered like a low flame. David paced, ranting, gesturing, pointing. And I listened with complete calm. Not because their words didn't hurt, but because, for the first time in my life, their words didn't control me. I didn't defend myself. I didn't justify. I didn't explain. I didn't absorb. I just listened. And the more they spoke, the more I realized how deeply I had changed. When the room finally went quiet and 3 angry faces stared at me, expecting my apology, or my agreement, or my financial commitment, I simply breathed in, breathed out, and waited. Because I knew exactly what I would say next, but not yet, not until they were done. And for once in my life, I let them run out of words before I used mine. For a long moment after their accusations finally died down, the apartment felt unnaturally still. My parents stood frozen in the center of my living room, coats half unzipped, snow melting onto my rug. David paced near the coffee table like a caged animal, waiting for me to break the silence with the same predictable sentence I'd used my entire life. Okay, I'll help. But he didn't say it. Instead, I let the quiet stretch. I let it settle over the room like dust, like truth, like the final seconds before a long overdue storm breaks. My hands were steady, my breathing calm, my heartbeat slow, not from numbness, but from certainty. Mom was the first to speak again. Her tone was a mix of frustration and entitlement, wrapped in the faux softness she used whenever she wanted something from me. "Ava, sweetheart, listen. You saved the house once, you can save it again. It's not a big deal for you." Dad nodded instantly, stepping closer, authority rolling off him like heat. "You've always been the responsible one. Your brother needs help right now. And the repairs are urgent. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." A familiar sentence, a familiar script. One they had rehearsed for decades. Then David added, "You know, if you cared at all about this family, you wouldn't even hesitate." And that finally was enough. I looked up at him. At all of them. The people I had spent my entire life bending myself into knots to support. The people who saw my generosity as currency they were entitled to spend. The people who believed my strength meant I didn't deserve softness. The people who had replaced gratitude with expectation long ago. And with a voice as quiet as snowfall and just as irrevocable, I said the word I had never dared to say to them before. No. It was a small word, a soft word. But in the silence that followed, it hit the room like a slammed door. David stopped pacing. Dad's shoulders stiffened. Mom's eyes widened, her lips parting as if I had slapped her. "What did you say?" Mom whispered. "No," I repeated, my tone unchanged. "I'm not saving the house again. I'm not fixing David's financial messes. I'm not covering anything else. Not now, not ever." The disbelief on their faces was so raw it almost would have been funny if it weren't so incredibly sad. Dad stepped forward. "Ava, don't be ridiculous. You've always helped. That's your role in this family." "My role?" I echoed softly. Mom's voice rose, sharp with panic. "What's gotten into you? Why are you acting like this?" "Because," I said, finally standing, "I'm done pretending my value is tied to how much I can give you. I'm done being your backup plan, your fixer, your wallet, your emotional sponge. I'm done." Their mouths opened in unison, shock, rage, confusion mixing like storm clouds, but I didn't give them time to speak. Instead, I walked to the console table near the entryway, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a white envelope I'd prepared months ago. I didn't expect to use it, not now. Not like this, but when I sealed it, a part of me must have already known this day would come. I carried it back into the living room and set it gently on the coffee table. David frowned. "What's that?" I looked at him, then at my parents. "Everything," I said. "Every bill I paid for you, every overdue charge I covered, every loan, every emergency, every month you needed help, every dollar I spent to save the house. Every credit card payment, late fee, insurance lapse, medical bill, and David's so-called business investments. I documented all of it." Dad scoffed. "Why would you do that?" "So none of us could rewrite history," I replied. "So you couldn't claim I never helped. So you couldn't pretend my no was sudden or unreasonable." "Ah." Mom reached for the envelope with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the first page. As she turned each sheet, her face tightened, shock giving way to embarrassment, then anger, then something like shame she refused to show. At the very bottom of the final page, I had typed one single line. "This is everything I have ever given you. There will be no more after today." Mom's voice cracked. "Ava, how dare you keep track like this? It's cruel. It's cold. This is ungrateful. Ungrateful." The word hung between us like a dripping icicle. David shook his head furiously. "I can't believe you'd throw this in our faces after everything we've done for you." "Done for me?" I said calmly. "Like excluding me from Christmas? Like showing up today to demand more money? Like calling me dramatic for telling the truth?" Dad's jaw clenched. "We are your family. You owe us respect." "No," I said, and it wasn't just an answer, but a liberation. I owe myself respect, and I owe myself a life that isn't spent carrying 3 adults who refuse to carry themselves. David's voice rose. "You're unbelievable. After everything we've given you, You didn't give me, I corrected, my voice like steel wrapped in softness. You took from me, and I let you. That ends now. Silence again. Heavy, suffocating. But this time, I wasn't the one drowning in it. I stepped back, meeting each of their eyes. I don't owe anyone in this house another dollar, another apology, another explanation, another sacrifice. I have spent 30 years being the responsible one. I'm choosing myself now. Mom's face crumpled into anger. So you're just abandoning us? Leaving us to fend for ourselves? I nodded once. Yes, the same way you left me out in the cold this Christmas. Dad opened his mouth to argue, but I raised a hand, calm, firm, final. It's time for you to go. They stared at me like they didn't recognize me, like the girl who always said yes had vanished and been replaced by someone they couldn't control. And in a way, she had. David scoffed, turning toward the door. Fine, but don't come crawling back when you realize how selfish this is. Mom followed, muttering under her breath. Dad lingered a moment longer, as if hoping I'd crack, but I didn't. I simply held the door open, waiting. Finally, he stepped out, and I closed the door behind them. No tears, no guilt, no second guessing. Just a quiet, powerful certainty. I didn't owe them anything anymore. New Year's Eve arrived only a few days after I had closed the door on my family literally and figuratively. I didn't know their plans, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't care. The weight that had once tied my emotions to their expectations was gone, replaced by a quiet steadiness I barely recognized. I spent the morning taking down my Christmas decorations with the teens who came back to help, laughing about how we'd somehow managed to burn half a tray of cookies but saved the other half with teamwork. My heart felt full in a way I couldn't explain, like a room inside me had finally been opened. But in another part of Oregon, in a house I once saved, the evening was unfolding very differently. My parents had planned a large New Year's Eve gathering not just to celebrate but to repair their reputation after the Christmas fiasco. Their goal was simple: make sure the extended family saw them as the respectable, proud household they believed themselves to be. They also planned to introduce David's fiancée, a woman I'd never met but had heard about in passing. According to David, she was from a good family, which meant in his mind that she would be someone to impress. Impressing people had always been their currency, but this time, they didn't have mine to spend. By early evening, relatives began arriving. Cars pulled up in front of the house. Coats were shaken off. Bottles of wine were offered. Compliments were exchanged. And almost immediately, things began to unravel. The food was the first sign. My parents had under-budgeted and overestimated their ability to host a crowd. Platters ran empty before half the guests arrived. My mother tried to hide her panic, whispering to my father to run out and buy more. But he hissed back that the stores were closed and they should have prepared better. A simple argument, but the kind that cracks the first seam. The decorations were the next. Half the string lights flickered like dying fireflies, and the large banner reading Happy New Year 202X hung crookedly, taped instead of pinned because the pushpins had run out. My parents normally would have asked me to fix something like that quietly, behind the scenes, without credit, but I wasn't there. And the banner stayed crooked. Then the roof started leaking. A slow drip at first, then a steady plink 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 into a decorative bowl on the dining table. Guests paused mid-conversation, glancing upward as though the ceiling itself were groaning under the pressure of years of financial neglect. My mother nearly cried. My father cursed under his breath. David barked orders as if yelling at the house would stop the water from falling. But the worst problem struck when the heat went out. One moment the house was warm, buzzing with the chatter of relatives. The next, the air thinned into a cold draft that seeped under doorways and wrapped itself around people's ankles. The furnace, neglected for years, sputtered and died with a loud metallic cough. A cousin from Bend joked that it felt like they were at an outdoor camping trip. No one laughed. Guests started rubbing their hands together, pulling scarves from their bags, asking awkwardly, "Are you sure the heat is coming back on?" My parents insisted it was just temporary, but their voices trembled. No one believed them. As the discomfort grew, so did the questions. Where's Ava? I haven't seen her in forever. She's always the one helping with these things. Is she coming later? My mother's face tightened more with each inquiry. My father grumbled excuses about me being busy, uncooperative, dramatic. But relatives notice things they always do. An aunt leaned in and whispered, "Did something happen at Christmas?" A cousin asked, "Why wasn't she invited?" Another chimed in, "She's the responsible one. It's strange she's not here." Quote. And then, because every family has at least one person who doesn't know how to keep a secret, my great-uncle, already tipsy from champagne, blurted out the truth in a single careless moment. Well, considering Ava's the one who paid over $400,000 to save this house last year, maybe she needed a break. The room fell silent. Utterly, painfully silent. My mother's glass froze halfway to her lips. My father's face drained of color. David nearly dropped the mini quiche he was holding. Guests stared at them confused, stunned, whispering, "Ava paid what? $450,000? She saved the house? Why didn't you tell us? Why isn't she here then?" It was the exact kind of revelation my parents had spent their lives avoiding, the kind that peeled back the glossy surface they'd polished for others and exposed the truth underneath. They were not the stable, generous, self-sufficient family they portrayed themselves to be. They had been carried quietly, consistently by the one daughter they undervalued. Mom tried to regain control of the narrative, but the relatives were relentless, pressing for details, shocked that they would treat the child who saved their home with such indifference. Dad tried to defend himself, but his words cracked under the weight of contradiction. Someone asked why they didn't repay me. Another wondered aloud how they could cut me out of Christmas after such a sacrifice, and then the dam broke. It started with my parents arguing with each other, loudly, in front of everyone. Mom blamed Dad for the financial decisions. Dad blamed Mom for mismanaging the bills. Both blamed David for borrowing money he never repaid. David shouted that they should have managed their own finances better. Mom cried that David was supposed to be the successful one, and Dad retorted that I had been the only dependable child they had. Guests stood there frozen, clutching plates and champagne glasses, watching the image of the perfect family crumble into shards at their feet. And in the middle of it all, David's fiancée stood quietly, arms crossed, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and certainty. She saw everything, every selfish demand, every unspoken expectation, every crack in the foundation of their dynamics. When David tried to pull her aside, she shook her head, whispered something sharp, and walked out of the house without looking back. He chased her to the porch, but she got into her car, slammed the door, and drove away. David returned inside red-faced and humiliated. The party ended early. People left in uncomfortable waves, murmuring that they had to get going, wrapping scarves tight around their necks, eager to escape the cold, literal and emotional. And while I wasn't there to witness it myself, word travels fast in families. By the next morning, 3 separate relatives had texted me versions of the same message. "It all fell apart without you. They finally showed their true colors. You deserved better, Ava. So much better." And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the slightest sting of guilt. Only relief. Only freedom. Only the quiet, peaceful truth that my absence had revealed more than my presence ever could. A year passes quietly, when you're no longer carrying the weight of people who refuse to carry themselves. It slips by in small, gentle increments, morning sunlight through new curtains, the hum of a coffee maker in a home that finally feels peaceful, the soft laughter of people who show up not because they expect anything from you, but because they care. That was what the last 12 months felt like for me, a steady unfolding, a slow blooming of a life that was finally mine. I didn't speak to my parents again after that New Year's Eve, not out of bitterness, not out of anger, just absence, silence. The kind of quiet that feels natural, like a chapter closing exactly where it was supposed to. In the beginning, I kept expecting guilt to creep in. I kept waiting for that familiar tug, the sense of obligation, the reflex to check on them, fix things, put myself last. But it never came. Not once. And that was how I knew I had made the right choice. Work flourished in a way it never had when I was splitting myself between my job and my family's endless emergencies. Without the emotional drain, my focus sharpened. My confidence grew. I earned a promotion, then a team lead position. I took certification courses I had put off for years. For the first time in my adult life, I attended conferences without worrying about getting a panicked call about overdue bills. I said yes to opportunities because I wanted them, not because I needed the extra money to stabilize someone else's chaos. And with each step forward, the part of me that had once clung to my family's approval loosened and disappeared. I traveled, 2 places I had dreamed about but always postponed. A long weekend in Vancouver, a week exploring the redwoods in Northern California, a quiet solo trip to a cabin in Montana during the fall, where the trees glowed like amber flames. Every moment felt like reclaiming time I didn't know I'd lost. 6 months after the split, I bought a small house. Nothing extravagant. A little one-story place with big windows, warm wooden floors, and a backyard garden I filled with basil, tomatoes, lavender, and things I didn't know how to grow but tried anyway. The house wasn't large, but it was filled with light, with intention, with peace. And above all, with the feeling that every corner, every shelf, every chair, every plant belonged to me because I chose it. My family, now, looked different. Better. There was Mr. Ellis, my elderly neighbor, who came over every other Thursday for soup and conversation. There was Maya, whose daughter Emma had declared my house her second Christmas home. There were the teens from my mentoring program, several of whom stopped by on weekends to help in the garden or cook dinner together, turning my kitchen into a noisy, joyful mess of spices and jokes. These were the people who filled my life with laughter, warmth, and sincerity, none of which required me to shrink myself to fit their expectations. And when December came around again, I didn't feel dread. I didn't feel the old ache. I didn't feel the ghost of last year's rejection. Instead, I spent the week before Christmas setting up my home for another holiday dinner, a bigger one this time. More food, more lights, more chairs pulled from every corner of the house. I strung warm golden lights along the windows, hung simple evergreen garlands, and cooked enough food to feed half the neighborhood. When I opened my door on Christmas Eve, the people I loved filled the space with soft laughter, loud chatter, and the kind of comfort that doesn't have to announce itself to be real. It was warm, alive, full of everything I had once begged my family to give me. On New Year's Eve, we did it again, this time with music loud enough to shake the walls, a bonfire crackling in the backyard fire pit, and a countdown shouted with genuine joy instead of forced smiles. At midnight, as fireworks burst across the Portland sky, someone put a hand on my shoulder and asked gently, "Do you ever miss them? Your family?" I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. I looked out at the glowing sky. The sparklers kids were waving, the people hugging and laughing around the fire, and I said with a calmness that surprised even me, "I miss what I used to imagine they could be. But I don't miss the reality. And I don't use my strength to hold on to illusions anymore." Quote. The person nodded, understanding. Truly understanding. Later that night, after the guests left and the house quieted into a soft hum, I stood alone in my living room. Fairy lights glowed against the windows. Leftover desserts sat half-eaten on the table. A blanket someone forgot lay draped over the couch. My home felt warm even in the silence, alive, loved, lived in. I thought back to the girl I had been a year earlier, the one standing in an empty office parking lot, snow falling around her, whispering, "Okay, noted," into the winter air. She had been exhausted, worn thin, still trying, still hoping, still believing she needed to earn her place in her own family. I wished I could reach back through time and touch her shoulder, tell her what she would discover. That peace doesn't come from people who demand your strength, it comes from those who respect your boundaries. That belonging isn't found in DNA, it's found in sincerity. That family is not defined by obligation but by warmth. As I turned off the lights and headed toward bed, one last thought came to me, soft, true, and steady. I once thought I owed them loyalty, but I only ever owed myself a gentle, honest life. And the year they told me, "Don't come to Christmas," was the year I finally started living it.